In 1919, London was just waking from the long nightmare of the First World War. Suddenly, a dazzling show blew into town, promising escape to exotic Arabia.
Come with me to the land of history, mystery, and romance.
Londoners, starved for heroes after 4 years of brutal trench warfare, swarmed to see documentary footage and color glass slides of a dashing young Englishman who seemed to spearhead a heroic revolt that brought down an empire. From the moment the show premiered, the world knew Thomas Edward Lawrence as Lawrence of Arabia.
Lawrence is an action hero and an intellectual hero in one, which sets him apart from any of the other famous warriors in the 20th century.
But with fame came controversy.
Lawrence certainly played some role. I don't think that he was the spark plug of that revolt. He was important, and he became, in fact, more important after the war.
He made of his life a mysterious puzzle and sort of throws down the challenge to us to figure out what was real and what was not, what was fantasy and what was fact.
Who was T.E. Lawrence? What did he really do? And did the myth match the man? By 1916, war raged across Europe as Britain and her allies, France and Russia, tried to beat back German and Austrian attacks. Millions of men on both sides were fighting and dying from machine gun fire, poison gas, and disease. But T.E. Lawrence was far from the action, stuck in an office in Cairo. For Europe's war was a world war. The Turkish Ottoman Empire, which straddled the Middle East from the Black Sea to the Persian Gulf, had begun fighting on Germany's side. It beat Britain in battle after battle and almost captured the Suez Canal, Britain's lifeline to its colonies. Lawrence was a low-level officer in Britain's Middle East headquarters at the time. Far above him in rank, officials were urgently looking for an Arab leader to start a revolt against the Ottoman Empire. They found one in Sharif Hussein, traditional protector of Mecca and descendant of the Prophet Muhammad.
The British made the vague promise that if the Arabs under Sharif Hussein would rebel against their Ottoman masters, that they would gain an independent Arab state under Britain's sponsorship at the conclusion of the war.
Britain chose the desert leader Sharif Hussein for both practical and romantic reasons.
The British had decades ago decided that the Arabs were a people whose pure and genuine strains were to be found in the desert among tribal peoples, and whose corrupt and false strains were to be found in the cities among the politicians.
In June 1916, Sharif Hussein and his sons began the Arab revolt with Britain's guarantee, or so they thought. They forced the Ottoman army out of the holy city of Mecca, but minimal training and support from Britain brought them to a standstill. Lawrence, assigned to make maps, interview prisoners, and write intelligence reports, watched the Arab revolt from afar, with dreams of glory and growing impatience.
He had such intense capacities and ambition and power and such ambiguity about it. He himself, in sort of exasperation, wrote, "I hate to lead, but I don't obey orders."
One day in October 1916, Lawrence took a leave of absence from his desk job in Cairo. He would never return to that desk again. He set off on an unofficial trip to the desert to see the ailing Arab revolt for himself. His meeting with Sharif Hussein's son, Faisal, changed his life.
I felt at first glance that this was the man I had come to Arabia to seek. the leader who would bring the Arab revolt to full glory.
Regal, ambitious, and willing to listen, Faisal saw in Lawrence a useful ally. And Lawrence saw in Faisal's men a mobile fighting force with untapped potential.
The Arab movement is shallow, not because the Arabs do not care, but because they are few. And in their smallness of number lies a good deal of their strength.
Back in Cairo, Lawrence argued that the Arab revolt needed guidance, funds, and weapons, but not British troops. With huge casualties on the Western Front, that was exactly what his superiors wanted to hear.
Lawrence was the same as all the other Brits in that era. He was trying to expand Britain's influence, and the best people to do this, in his view, were tribal populations. They were much more easy in many cases to manipulate, or so the British thought.
Though other British officers were already in the field, Lawrence had made a good impression on Faisal. Headquarters sent him out to the desert as Faisal's official liaison.
Lawrence was the very picture of an intelligence analyst, bringing academic rigor, skepticism, subject matter expertise, familiarity with languages to his role as an intelligence officer. That's what made him indispensable, and that's what gave his superiors the confidence in him, in his abilities, to send him off into the desert to do something on his own.
It was as if T.E. Lawrence had been training for this moment all his life. Fascinated with chivalry and the Crusades since childhood, when Lawrence was in college, he headed to the Ottoman-occupied Middle East to survey Crusader castles. Warned that he might not come back alive, he went anyway, walking 1,100 miles alone through Syria and Palestine in 1909.
The walking tours alone in Syria, he learned the land, he learned how to live off the land, he learned how to live as a Bedouin, as a villager. He learned how to fit in with them.
From the beginning, he trained himself to endure foodless weeks and waterless nights and sleepless, and he would just test himself to the limits of his endurance.
Lawrence had gone to Syria to study the Crusades, but when he came face to face with the Arabs whose ancestors fought the Crusaders, he wanted to know more. During the next 3 years, he would spend many months in northern Syria at an archaeological site called Carchemish.
His stay at Carchemish was probably the happiest time of his life, where he really developed a great affection for the land, for the people.
It was at Carchemish that Lawrence's wildly romantic vision of desert Arabs and his own connection with them first took shape.
The Bedouin of the desert, born and grown up in it, had embraced with all his soul this nakedness too harsh for volunteers. In his life, he had air and winds, sun and light, open spaces, and a great emptiness.
He kind of invented his identity as he went along, out of his own soul, really, his own interest in medievalism, in archaeology, in origins, roots, romantic peoples to be liberated.
War would give Lawrence's idealized view of the desert and its people a harder strategic edge.
They are perhaps the most elusive enemy an army ever had, and inhabit one of the most trying countries in the world for civilized warfare.
By early 1917, Lawrence, based in the desert with Faisal's warriors, began to see a larger role for the Arab revolt, and he set out to prove it. The strategically located port city of Akaba was midway between the Sinai Desert and the vital Hejaz Railroad. Ottoman Turkish troops based in town dominated both. The Ottomans' huge cannons were locked in position permanently facing the Red Sea, the only possible route of attack. Behind the city lay a desert so harsh that it was left unguarded. Lawrence and Faisal agreed to do the impossible: attack Akaba from the desert.
So I decided to go my own way, with or without orders. I wrote a letter full of apologies, that my intentions were of the best, and went.
Not only did Lawrence ignore the orders that he was in Arabia under, it appears that he mounted the expedition to Akaba entirely of his own volition, and his superiors in Egypt had no idea where he was.
With close to 50 tribal warriors, Lawrence left Faisal's camp and disappeared into the desert. Crossing desolate, forbidding landscapes, visiting one remote oasis after another, they slowly cobbled together an army and held it together with gold and promises of loot and freedom from the Turks. After 8 weeks, 2,000 Arabs suddenly swept into Akaba in a surprise attack. Akaba was theirs.
Akaba was a very significant victory, not just for the Arabs, but for the British as well. Once Lawrence took Akaba, the Arab revolt all of a sudden was on the Turks' doorstep.
The new general, Edmund Allenby, instantly understood what the startling victory at Akaba meant. The Arabs could play a role in winning the larger war. Allenby gave Lawrence weapons and gold and the freedom to fight in his own unconventional way. Together with Faisal's men, Lawrence launched a series of harassing raids that damaged but didn't destroy the Hejaz and Transjordan railroads, the only source of supplies and reinforcements for the Turkish Ottoman troops.
This show is splendid. You cannot imagine greater fun for us, greater vexation and fury for the Turks.
There's a note from his immediate superior in Egypt to another office in Cairo saying, well, a train was blown up in southern Syria a few days ago. I think we can probably assume then that Captain Lawrence is actually still there.
What he did was create a theory of warfare, of how to succeed in warfare without fighting battles. He said, if you can keep hundreds of thousands of men on garrison duty, standing guard against you because they don't know where you're going to strike next, that's a very effective form of warfare.
Lawrence's writings on guerrilla warfare would inspire generations of fighters, from the North Vietnamese to U.S. Army Special Operations.
Lawrence was the first to articulate a doctrine of guerrilla warfare in any rational manner. And it's no coincidence, I think, that from the time that Lawrence does that in late 1916, early 1917, that the guerrilla war against the Turks in Arabia becomes much more effective, much more potent.
Within months, 17 train engines, miles of track, and several strategic villages fell to the British and Arab raiders. And the longer Lawrence fought beside the Arabs, the more he started to make their cause his own.
After the capture of Akaba, things in the field changed so much that I was no longer a witness of the revolt, but a protagonist in the revolt.
Lawrence went to Arabia as a liaison officer. That's all he was supposed to do, was to liaise with the Arab revolt. But once he was in a position to do something about it, he became, for all intents and purposes, an Arab independence activist.
What Lawrence and dozens of other British officials were trying to do was to set up a form of indirect rule, where there would be an Arab government of sorts under British protection, under British control, but which would be autonomous or semi-independent. I don't think they really wanted full Arab independence. There's every evidence that they didn't.
My own ambition is that the Arabs should be our first brown dominion, and not our last brown colony.
Lawrence represented Great Britain, the most powerful colonial empire on earth. But his new goal of Arab freedom was about to collide with the intentions of his own government. After promising freedom to the Arabs, Britain turned and made a secret deal with its ally France to carve up the Middle East between them when the war ended. The agreement was called the Sykes-Picot Accord, and there was no room in it for Arab independence.
Lawrence found himself cast in the role of the lead recruiter of the Arab tribes for this Arab revolt. And he had to then, on a daily basis, make promises about Arab independence that he knew would probably not be honored after the war. And the sense that he was lying to the very people that he was asking to sacrifice on the British behalf weighed upon him heavily.
We are calling them to fight for us on a lie, and I can't stand it.
Lawrence's private shame became a public scandal when the lie was suddenly exposed. In November 1917, newspapers around the world published the Sykes-Picot Accord.
The Hashemites, the Arab world, and the world found out about Sykes-Picot when Comrade Leon Trotsky, the Commissar for Foreign Affairs of the new Bolshevik regime in Russia, published all the secret treaties that the Tsar's the diplomats had entered into, including the Sykes-Picot Accords, and British diplomats had to scramble all over the Arab world to try and explain the inexplicable and justify the unjustifiable.
That same month, another controversial British document with yet another promise hit the newsstands. The Balfour Declaration guaranteed Britain's support for a Jewish homeland in Palestine, territory already promised to the Arabs and to France.
To a certain extent, the British felt their national survival was at risk, and they would make any agreement to survive as a nation. And the details, the difficulties could be worked out once the war in Europe was over. British policy in the Middle East had no central controlling authority. It was a ship without a rudder.
Lawrence's Bedouin allies asked him which British pledge they should believe. Disgusted with himself, he reassured them of Britain's good intentions.
The Hashemites continued to cooperate with the British because they really had no choice. They had thrown in their lot with the British. I doubt that they ever trusted them. They had all the more reason to distrust them after the publication of Sykes-Picot.
In revenge, I vowed to make the Arab revolt the engine of its own success, and vowed to lead it madly in the final victory.
But victory looked far away in 1917. On the Western Front, British troops fell back under withering German assaults. In the Middle East, summer's heat turned to freezing winter, and defeat followed defeat. Surrounded by brutality and death, Lawrence grew increasingly sickened by his own role in the violence.
I'm not going to last out this game much longer. Nerves going and temper wearing thin. I hope when the nightmare ends that I will wake up and become alive again. This killing and killing of Turks is horrible.
Lawrence came close to resigning. He thought of suicide. But less than a month after the Sykes-Picot headlines, the Middle East, long considered a sideshow in the greater war effort, unexpectedly took center stage. In one pitched battle after another, General Allenby was closing in on the city of Jerusalem, which had been under Ottoman rule since the 1500s. Allenby invited Lawrence to join the Victory March.
By 1917, the British people had been asked to make incredible, unprecedented sacrifices to keep the war effort in France going. They had to be offered something that would make that sacrifice seem meaningful. And the capture of the Holy Land. The capture of the Holy Land was something that would have had a broad appeal to people of Victorian religious ideals.
General Allenby's triumphant entry into Jerusalem just before Christmas restored Britain's flagging spirit and turned the tide in the Middle East. The Turks were on the run. Lawrence traded his Arab robes for a uniform and joined the procession. There he ran into Lowell Thomas, an ambitious young American journalist looking for a colorful story for the folks back home. Lawrence more than fit the bill. The few days Thomas spent filming him became the multimedia show that later made them both world famous. Thomas photographed Lawrence at a crucial moment. With the Turks finally in retreat, he began to see a way to fulfill the promise he'd made to the Arabs and himself: take Damascus. One of the world's oldest cities, dating back perhaps to 6000 BC, Damascus was the political heart of the Arab world. In 1917, it was in Ottoman hands. According to Sykes-Picot, it would be passed on to France after the war. If Faisal reached Damascus first and staked his claim, his victory might force France to back down. Lawrence urged Faisal on, and the race for Damascus began.
There was a kind of grand seeking to do great deeds. So it was quite natural for him to say, we can take Damascus, why not Damascus? And, put these great visions in front of them.
That was what was significant about his mission in the desert. Not that he changed minds, not that he persuaded people to become Arab nationalists, but that he persuaded them, now is the time, your goal is attainable.
I meant to make a new nation, to restore a lost influence, to give 20 millions of Semites the foundation on which to build an inspired dream palace of their national thoughts.
Eloquent megalomania. It's a conceit of people like Lawrence, who are agents of a great imperial power, to think that they are the ones who create nations. Nations eventually create themselves.
It was certainly a passion for his own individual destiny, an obsession with doing something of import that led him to want to pick that particular nation and make something of it. I mean, how far can you play with other people's lives and destinies to fulfill your own,
But Faisal's troops did not liberate Damascus. No one did. The Turks had left days before Allenby's and Faisal's forces both poured into the city. It was neither the grand climax nor clear victory Lawrence had dreamed of. In the chaos of newly liberated Damascus, General Allenby met Faisal for the first time. With Lawrence translating, Allenby told Faisal that until peace talks began, he could administer Damascus and Syria, but only under French control. That was not what Faisal or Lawrence had been fighting for. They parted with heavy hearts.
When Faisal had gone, I made to Allenby the last, and also I think the first request I ever made him for myself. Leave to go away. In the end he agreed, and then at once I knew how much I was sorry.
After almost 2 years of desert combat, Lawrence's greatest battles were about to begin. November 1918 marked the end of the First World War. Britain and France had defeated Germany and the Ottoman Empire. In Damascus, Faisal defiantly began to set up an independent Syrian government. But the future of the Middle East was being decided far away, in Paris, where the winners and losers of the Great War were gathering. Lawrence sent word for Faisal to join him in France.
This is someone for whom Lawrence felt a certain amount of sympathy, and towards whom Lawrence felt a great deal of guilt. That is clear. He, in others, felt that he let Faisal down in some measure. Faisal was let down, not just by Lawrence, by the British.
With his flamboyant Arab headdress, Lawrence made himself the star of the peace conference. Winston Churchill called him one of nature's greatest princes. Together, Faisal and Lawrence stood before the Council of World Leaders and made an impassioned plea for Arab independence.
Faisal was up against an absolutely brutal French policy, which intended to prevent an independent Arab state in Syria or anywhere else, for that matter. He needed the support of the British.
But the Sykes-Picot Accord prevailed. France won Syria and Lebanon. Britain took Palestine and Iraq. For war-ravaged Britain, controlling Iraq and its oil was more important than keeping a promise to the Arabs.
Lawrence was suddenly confronted for the first time with the absolute failure of his will. Up till now, he had been able, beyond his own agonies of duplicity, to pretty much obtain what he wanted in the field and to make things happen. And here he was, suddenly having lost this magic power he had. That's how it must have been experienced He was back in his suit, and he was a little fellow at the conference, and nothing he did helped, nothing.
Come with me to the land of history.
Just days after the peace conference ended, Lowell Thomas and his traveling extravaganza set up shop in London's Royal Opera House. It made Lawrence a star. During the next several months, over 1 million people would see the show in London alone. Lawrence was alarmed by his new fame and drawn to it. He had fought an unconventional war. His diplomacy would be just as unconventional.
He did collaborate with Lowell Thomas in London, posed for further photos, and articles that Lowell Thomas wrote were indirectly dictated by Lawrence to suit the battle he was fighting for the Arab political cause.
Lawrence was probably one of the first 20th century figures to understand how the media could be used to further a public career and to further advocacy of public causes.
The cause would soon grow urgent. Faisal returned to Damascus and was elected king of Syria, the first independent Arab state. It lasted only 4 months. 90,000 French troops marched in, crushed his government, occupied Damascus, and sent him into exile, with Britain's blessing. With Faisal suddenly stateless, Lawrence began a frantic letter-writing campaign. It would unexpectedly pay off.
Lawrence's sending of anonymous letters to newspapers to try and influence policy is a sign of the desperation that he feels in his advocacy of Arab independence, which has become his mission in life by that point.
Struggling to somehow make his government keep its promises to the Arabs, Lawrence came close to collapse. But so did Iraq, where 10,000 Iraqis and 450 British soldiers died fighting in the first months of occupation. Lawrence went on the attack.
The people of England have been led into a trap which will be hard to escape with dignity and honor. They have been tricked by a steady withholding of information.
He wrote about Iraq in the British papers, scathingly critical of the British administration there, scathingly critical of the British army in Iraq.
Our government is worse than the old Turkish system. How long will we permit thousands of imperial troops and tens of thousands of Arabs to be sacrificed on behalf of colonial administration, which can benefit nobody but its administrators?
Lawrence's guerrilla diplomacy worked. Winston Churchill, the newly appointed colonial secretary, begged Lawrence to help salvage the crisis in Iraq. The Cairo Conference of 1921 offered Faisal's brother Abdullah the newly created kingdom of Jordan, which his descendants still rule today. Faisal was put on the throne of Iraq, which his family ruled until the late 1950s. It seemed like a tidy solution at the time, but the unforeseen consequences were enormous.
All of the crises in the Middle East today have their origin in the British effort in the Middle East during the First World War and in the British and French mandates immediately following the war. And in the Cairo Conference, Lawrence, Churchill, people like these, I think when we look at the roots of the Middle East crises today, we have to look to them as the originators.
Lawrence never knew the long-term results of his exercise in nation-building, but the short-term impact filled him with both pride and shame. He claimed the Cairo settlement was the big achievement of his life, then called what he'd done in Arabia morally indefensible. Lawrence retreated from public life to his alma mater, Oxford, to finish writing his account of the Arab revolt. He called it 7 Pillars of Wisdom, and hoped it would compare to epic novels like Moby Dick and the Brothers Karamazov. Instead, it became a classic in a category all its own.
7 Pillars of Wisdom is a memoir. It is a military campaign history. It is a travelogue all in one.
For years we lived in the naked desert, under the indifferent heaven. By day the hot sun fermented us, and we were dizzied by the beating wind. At night we were stained by dew, and shamed into pettiness by the innumerable silences of stars. We were devoted to freedom, a purpose so ravenous that it devoured all our strength, a hope so transcendent that our earlier ambitions faded in its glare.
You read it and you get a sense of the majesty of the prose, and you don't tire of that. The book is absolutely splendid.
Lawrence hoped his book would set the record straight and clear his troubled conscience. It did neither.
It's a beautifully written book, but is it truth? It wasn't meant to be truth. It is almost impossible to confirm many of the details in the Hashemite or Ottoman or British records.
It has been taken as a straight factual memoir. There's much evidence that he never intended it to be, and it was more in the nature of almost like of an historical novel.
The accuracy of details, large and small, and the significance of Lawrence's role in the Arab Revolt continue to be debated today.
I'm a bit biased on the matter of Lawrence's truthfulness. The scores of people I interviewed that were present during one or another part of his life found him to be very forthcoming and true in what he had to say, because they could check out what he said from other sources, and honest on the whole. What was true was he had a kind of quality of dramatic self-exaggeration.
T.E. Lawrence had tried to make history, but it had not bent to his will. He tried to write history, but was convinced he'd failed. Now he would try to escape history. Hounded by the press, he changed his name to Ross and then Shaw, and he disappeared into the ranks of the Royal Air Force. As Private Shaw, he served quietly for almost 13 years. In February 1935, he retired. On May 12th, he wrote,
At present, I'm sitting in my cottage and getting used to an empty life.
The next morning, he took his motorcycle for a ride as usual, speeding down country lanes. He swerved to avoid two boys on bicycles and crashed. He never recovered consciousness. On May 19, 1935, Lawrence died. He was 46 years old. Winston Churchill joined family and friends for the funeral. He later wrote,
His pride and many of his virtues were superhuman. He could only fly in a hurricane. I fear whatever our need, we shall never see his like again.
If you were to say, what are the most important sources of what people in the United States and the West think about the Arab world, one of the core texts, one of the texts, one of the most important works ever produced is Seven Pillars of Wisdom. So you have a masterwork of a book. I mean, a wonderful book. You can read it and read it and reread it. But the idea that the desert is where Arabs are and Arabs are the desert is a terrible, terrible misapprehension, which was reinforced by this book.
I think it may be a constituent element of a certain kind of great man that wants to do great deeds and wants it so badly that he'll make it up and pretend he actually did. But that same drive is often enough to make them actually do great deeds. And that's the thing about Lawrence. Lawrence did do great deeds.
Some of the most thoughtful criticism that has been leveled at Lawrence is not accusations of hypocrisy or others, but accusation of trying to actually hijack history and therefore other people's lives in order to fulfill your own destiny. That can be construed as ultimate historical arrogance. You have to judge individually whether this accusation is really strong enough to dismiss everything he did.
Those who dream by night in the dusty recesses of their minds wake in the day to find that all was vanity. But the dreamers of the day are dangerous men, for they may act their dream with open eyes and make it possible. This I did.